Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. On the day of his coronation, Pedro el Cruel committed an atrocious act. Did he murder his own wife? Get ready to discover the truth after the dark history of the most ruthless king in Castile. Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. But before immersing ourselves in the horror of that fateful day, let's know the victim. Blanca de Bourbon. Imagine a young French princess, with just 16 years, arriving at the Castilian court as a woman of unique beauty, the chronicles say, with a delicate pale complexion that earned her the nickname of White Queen. His arrival in Castilla was full of promises and expectations, a political union between two powerful kingdoms, but also an unknown adventure in a strange land. His marriage to Pedro I, the King of Castile, promised stability. A powerful but unpredictable monarch, known for his cruelty and his innumerable lovers. She, an innocent young woman, hoping to find love and peace in her new home. However, fate had a tragedy prepared for the White Queen, a tragedy that would become a mystery that lasts to this day. His life in court was an enigma. The chronicles speak little of their personality, their interests, of their days. Only brief details of their marriage are mentioned, a union that, apparently, was far from being happy. It is said that Pedro ignored her, that she preferred her lovers, leaving Blanca in a solitude imposed by the same crown that had promised her a brilliant future. How did you live those years? What thoughts tormented it? What secrets keep your silence? Think of Castile in the 14th century. A convulsed kingdom, divided by civil wars and noble ambitions. The nobility, powerful and eager to power, constantly challenged the king's authority. Imagine imposing castles, but also villages razed by wars, peasants suffering oppression and uncertainty. It was a time of struggles of unstable power, betrayals and alliances, where anyone's life, even that of a king, was fragile. Dynastic disputes were frequent. Noble families fought for the control of territories and resources, weaving alliances and betrayals with the same ease with which they changed the side in battle. Remember that real power was not absolute. El rey tenía que lidiar constantemente con el poder de los grandes señores feudales, quienes a menudo imponían sus propias leyes y actuaban con impunidad. In this context of instability, the king's figure was key, but also vulnerable. Pedro I, known as El Cruel, reached the throne in the midst of this chaos. His reign, marked by violence and cruelty, would exacerbate even more existing tensions. His determination for maintaining absolute control, often through ruthless methods, faced him with a constant opposition. It was a dangerous game where a false step could cost you life. Imagine a young Pedro, son of King Alfonso XI and Maria de Portugal. His childhood was not a fairy tale. Castilla was in full boiling, with powerful nobles disputing control, and the court was a hotbed of intrigues. Since childhood, Pedro witnessed the unbridled ambition of the great lords, learning to maneuver in a hostile environment where loyalty was a luxury that few could afford. His education, in charge of tutors and preceptors, was marked by political instability. He learned to ride, handle weapons, and move in the complex power games that defined life in court. But beyond formal lessons, he learned an even more important lesson: survival in a world where betrayal was current currency. His father's early death marked a turning point. At a very early age, Pedro was immersed in the disputes for the succession, surrounded by enemies that longed for his fall. His youth and the fragility of his position made him a pawn in the game of noble ambitions. The struggle for power became his daily reality, shaping his character in a way that few could imagine. But the death of his father, Alfonso XI, in 1350, catapulted him to a dangerous situation. You were still a young prince, and although legitimate heir, the Castilian, divided and ambitious nobility did not see such a young king with good eyes. There were many who craved power, and some even planned to depart from the throne. Intrigues were woven in palaces and strengths, whispers in the halls and conspiracies in the shadows. The fight for the throne began. Your uncle, Enrique de Trastamara, a cunning and ambitious man, became your main rival. Enrique, although illegitimate, had the support of a powerful faction of the nobility that saw in him a more manageable king. The court was divided, each side weaving alliances, looking for support and preparing the land for a civil war. The conspiracies multiplied, and every day the tension in the air felt more. It was a struggle for power, for the crown of Castile. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. Despite your youth, you demonstrated an iron determination. You did not let yourself be intimidated by threats or betrayals. With the help of some loyal nobles and the support of the people, you began to consolidate your power. But the fight was long and bloody. The civil war broke out, facing brothers and friends in a brutal battle for the control of Castile. Each victory was fragile. Each defeat could mean the end of your reign before it started seriously. The nobility imposed a marriage with Blanca de Bourbon, a young French princess. For them, it was a strategic alliance, a way to ensure peace with France and strengthen your position. But for you, it was an imposition, an obstacle in your ambition for power. That I imagine that you saw her for the first time, an elegant and distant figure, with a brightness in her eyes that reflected, perhaps, the same fear you felt. Blanca was reluctant queen, forced to marry a man whom he barely knew, a man whose reputation was already beginning to be dyed with blood and cruelty. Your marriage was a political, cold and calculated union, plus a transaction than an act of love. That it probably did not take long to realize that the young princess did not share your ruthless ambitions. You should have felt attracted to its beauty and position, but as the days passed, the pressure of your reign, your enemies and ambitions moved you away from it. The distance between you became bigger, turning your marriage into a farce, a golden prison for both, she, a foreigner in a hostile court. You, a king trapped in his own intrigue network. But you were not just a king imposed by the nobility. From the beginning, you worked to build a powerful image. You understood the value of propaganda, to control the narrative. While you were casing with Blanca, stories about your courage, your justice, your unmatched ability to govern were already woven. Portraits were painted that showed you as a young king, fair and pious, even if the reality was, as soon as you would discover, quite different. Legends were promoted about your military feats, even exaggerating your victories. Your enemies were portrayed as cruel beasts, while you were presented as the ombudsman, the protector of Castile. Each public act, each decision, was carefully orchestrated to project the image of the ideal king, the strong and fair monarch that the kingdom needed. But behind that carefully constructed image, there was a much darker reality. Propaganda was a powerful weapon, yes, but I couldn't hide the truth completely. And the truth, in your case, was dyed with blood and betrayal. The gap between the public image and your true personality would grow with each decision, with each act of cruelty, feeding the shadows that would eventually engulf your reign. But that carefully built image staggered. Your first years of reign, far from being the golden age you had promised, were marked by instability that grew silently under the surface. The nobility, although I had crowned you, watched you suspicious. His loyalties were changing, his ambition, insatiable, was peace a facade, a hoax to consolidate your power before unleashing true chaos? Your initial decisions, although they seemed wise, hid a calculated coldness. Reconciliation with some powerful nobles, for example, was more a political strategy than a sample of good faith. Meanwhile, the economic situation of the kingdom was precarious, and the tension with the Kingdom of Granada was still latent, a constant threat in the south. Were you playing a dangerous game, walking on a fine line between apparent peace and an inevitable war? The death of your father, Alfonso XI, had left a void of power that you had filled with a mixture of strength and cunning. But the crown had not fallen into a silver tray. The struggle for power was still present, although hidden under a layer of apparent tranquility. While you consolidated your control over the kingdom, you sowed the seeds of your own destruction. Was your excessive ambition the prelude to the tragedy that was to come? Or were you simply a product of your time, a cruel king in a cruel era? In Seville, the court Bulia de Intrigas, you, still young, were surrounded by directors, noble and family, each with their own hidden agendas. Don Pedro de Castilla, your father, had left behind a legacy of territorial disputes and resentments that now had to manage. The nobility was divided into factions, willing to fight for power and influence. Note how the pieces move on this mortal chessboard. Among those key characters was your half-brother, Enrique de Constamara, a cunning and ambitious man who hid his true intentions after a loyalty mask. His personal attractiveness and his ability to win the favor of the people made him a dangerous rival. Be careful with him, because his smile can hide a dagger. Prosody? Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Then there was Maria de Padilla, your lover and a powerful figure in court. His influence on you was undeniable, generating jealousy and resentment between the nobility, who saw in it a threat to their power and stability of the kingdom. She was more than a simple lover. It was a key piece in the power game that was developed around you. His beauty and strength became weapons in the court of Seville. But the court not only breathed political intrigues, it was also impregnated with a more dangerous aroma. Favoritism. Maria de Padilla, your father's lover, had become an omnipresent figure. His captivating beauty and his influence on the king were evident to all. You watched with growing restlessness how their power grew, even eclipses seeing the legitimate queen. His ascent was meteoric. Maria de Padilla received titles, lands and wealth, all thanks to the real favor. The nobles, fearful of their power, aligned with it or conspired against them, depending on their convenience. But its influence was not limited to politics. It extended to all aspects of the court, including military and financial decision-making, something that worried you more and more. The situation became increasingly unstable. The presence of Maria de Padilla, so powerful and visible, was a constant threat to the stability of the kingdom and your future. You, still young, began to understand the complex network of alliances and betrayals that were woven around this woman. Her power and her influence on your father were a watchmaking pump about to explode. But the ascension of Maria de Padilla not only affected you, but lit the fuse of the rebellion between the Castilian nobility. Many nobles, accustomed to a power that escaped with your father's arrival, saw in Mary a threat to their privileges. Her influence in the court, her growing wealth and the real excessive favor towards her, fed distrust and murmuring. They felt dispossessed, ignored, and the tension was felt in every corner of the palace. Disputes were increasingly evident. The great lords, accustomed to sending, felt relegated to the background. The political decisions were made without their consultation. Their requests were ignored, and their influences were diluted before the omnipresence of Maria de Padilla and its relatives. The resentment became a breeding ground for conspiracy, betrayal, and open opposition to your reign, even before he even officially began. You, still young and with the crown on the horizon, faced a divided court and a nobility in arms. The shadow of the civil war planned about Castile, threatening to destroy everything your father had managed to build. The pressure was immense, maintaining control over a kingdom in crisis, while the ambitions of the nobles faced the influence of your lover. The challenge was capital, and the future appeared uncertain and full of dangers. But the threat was not limited to the unhappy nobility. Aragon, your powerful neighbor, carefully observed instability in Castilla. King Pedro, with his ambitions and his enemies, was an easy target for Aragonese expansion. Pedro IV of Aragon, known as the Ceremonious, did not lose sight of the opportunity to intervene in Castilian affairs, waiting for the right time to expand his kingdom. Diplomatic negotiations were intense. Both crowns exchanged emissaries, each trying to obtain strategic advantages. Pedro el Cruel, with his usual arrogance, underestimated the Aragonese threat, trusting his army and his ability to crush any rebellion, both internal and external. However, reality was more complex. The war with Aragon could end your reign. The threat of an Aragonese invasion was real and palpable. Pedro IV had an experienced and well-equipped army, ready to take advantage of any weakness in Castile. The diplomatic pressure intensified, with Aragon demanding territorial concessions and the recognition of its influence on Castilian affairs. You, like king, faced a crucial decision: yield to Aragonese demands or prepare for a war that could destroy your kingdom. But were acts of cruelty really, or Pedro acted out of necessity? You should consider the instability of the kingdom. The nobility, always eager for power, constantly conspired against him. His executions, often cruel, could be seen as measures to maintain control, to quell the rebellions that threatened to dismember Castilla. Was it a bloodthirsty despot, or a king who did what was necessary to preserve his crown? His political decisions, although often ruthless to your eyes, are framed within the context of the time. The civil war was a constant, and betrayal, a currency of habitual change. That he acted firmly, eliminating his real or potential enemies, before they could destabilize their reign completely. It was a ruthless power game, where clemency could be a luxury that could not afford. Prosody, speak. Speak to prosody rate equals 90%. Think about the situation. A young king, surrounded by powerful enemies looking for his fall. Was your cruelty a response to constant betrayal, a strategy to stay in power, or simply the expression of a violent nature? History, as always, offers several interpretations. You observe the actions, consider the context, and decide which qualifier corresponds to your reign. But returning to Pedro, his private life was as turbulent as his reign. You imagine the king, surrounded by luxury and power, but also tormented by intense passions and impulsive decisions. His love relationships were a reflection of his complex personality, a man capable of great affection, but also of ruthless cruelty when he felt threatened. His marriage to Blanca de Bourbon, a noble and possibly devout woman, was marked by coldness and distance. Peter's political ambition led him to seek strategic alliances, and it is possible that Blanca simply was never the center of his attention. Think of the rumors that had to circulate in the court, the whispers in the halls of the palace. But true love, or at least the overwhelming passion, arrived with Maria de Padilla, a beautiful and intelligent woman. Maria challenged social conventions and became the king's favorite lover. His relationship, although scandalous, was passionate and lasting, even after Maria's death. Imagine the intensity of their encounters, the risk they both ran. However, Peter's relations were not limited to Mary. He had other lovers, other connections that fed his desire and his need for power. Each of these relationships influenced politics, the palatial intrigues, the king's decisions. Were these relationships fruit of love or a cold political strategy? But what do we know of Blanca de Bourbon, the queen who shared life and the bed with this king so peculiar? Imagine it. A young Frenchman, newly arrived in the Castilian court, a world completely different from the one he knew. The language, customs, the atmosphere of intrigue that surrounded Pedro. Everything should be a tremendous cultural shock for her. She had to feel alone, observing from the shadow the whirlwind of her husband's life. His life in the Castilian court was surely marked by opulence, but also by uncertainty. Surrounded by powerful nobles, each with their own agendas and ambitions, Blanca had to carefully sail the turbulent waters of Castilian politics. How was your day-to-day? Did he feel safe in his position as queen, or lived with the constant fear of betrayal and the conspiracies that filled the court? Think of the portraits that have come to us from the time. Do they reflect the true personality of Blanca? Or are they just an idealized representation of the queen, a carefully constructed image to project the idea of power and stability that the kingdom needed? We may never know with certainty what his private life really was, but we can imagine the pressures to which he was subjected. Imagine the scene. Seville, crowded with people. You are there, among the expectant crowd, seeing how Pedro I, the cruel one, approaches the cathedral. The Castilian sun shines on gold and precious stones that adorn its clothes, hiding, for a moment, the darkness that houses its heart. The atmosphere is celebrated, but there is a feeling, a palpable tension in the air that even you, a simple spectator, you can feel. The ceremony is lavish, a deployment of power and wealth. Bishops, noble, gentlemen, everyone attends the coronation of this king who has already won a reputation. Controversial, let's say. You observe the solemnity of the ritual, the imposition of the crown, the moment when Pedro officially becomes King of Castile. But behind the pomp, you feel that something does not fit. The posterior party is a whirlwind of music, dance, and wine. But you, in the midst of the celebration, remember the stories that are whispered in the shadows. The palatial intrigues, the rivalries between nobles, and the rumors about the White Queen. The joy of coronation feels hollow, a mask that hides a much more sinister truth. The shadow of violence looms over opulence. But who ordered his death? That is the question that historians have persecuted for centuries. Some theories point to Enrique de Constamara, Peter's stepbrother, an ambitious man who saw in the death of the king an opportunity to ascend to the throne. Imagine the tension, secret planning, night meetings in candlelight. It is said that Enrique wove a network of allies, noble unhappy with Pedro's reign, thirsty for power and willing to spill blood. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. Others blame Maria de Padilla, Pedro's favorite lover. Although some saw her as a powerful figure, capable of influencing the king's decisions, others portray her as a victim, a woman trapped in a mortal political game. Was she a key piece in the conspiracy, or a simple puppet in the hands of other more powerful conspirators? Up to you. History offers you different perspectives. The truth, as is usually the case, hides between shadows and rumors. Perhaps we never know with certainty who gave the final order, who was the brain behind the conspiracy. But suspicions point to several key characters in court. Some historians mention powerful nobles, resentful of Pedro's actions, who saw in their death an opportunity to improve their social and economic position. There were many who benefited from their fall. Let's go back to the death of Blanca de Bourbon. A simple accident. How do they insist? His fall from the window of his room, was it really a slip, as they tried to make believe? Many doubted. You should too. Look at the details. The height of the window, the fragility of your health, the political circumstances of the moment. Everything points to something more sinister. Think about the suspicions that surrounded the death of the Queen. The rumors of poisoning, the palatial intrigues, the tensions between Pedro and his wife was an obstacle to Pedro's plans, a pawn in his power game. The official version never convinced everyone, and rightly. Subsequent investigations, or rather, the lack of them, only fed conspiracy theories. The speed with which the case was closed, the absence of an exhaustive exam. Was it a premeditated decision to silence the truth? Blanca's death is still a mystery, an enigma that persists in the history of Castile. Blanca's death did not go unnoticed. The Castilian nobility, divided between Pedro's supporters and detractors, watched with suspicion. Some, especially the nobles related to the Queen, whispered on the true nature of that accident. The suspicion of a real murder extended as a stain of ink in a scroll, staining the image of the king. You will ask yourself, what did they do? The answer is complex. Some noble, powerful, and with their own ambitions, saw in Blanca's death an opportunity to challenge Pedro. Others, more prudent, preferred to wait, observe how the situation was developed, calculating the consequences of any action against the king. The nobility response was not unanimous or immediate. The fear of real retaliation was palpable. Pedro, despite his cruelty, was a powerful king. His enemies knew that a false movement could mean ruin, jail, or even death. The conspiracy, if there was woven in secret, between whispers and furtive looks. Blanca's death was the spark that ignited the fuse. You already know that the Castilian nobility was divided, but now the tension became unbearable. The supporters of Enrique de Constamara, half-brother of Pedro, saw in the death of the Queen an opportunity to challenge the king. Enrique, always ambitious, took advantage of instability to gather his allies, promising them land and power if they helped him claim the throne. The rumor of a conspiracy spread like gunpowder, feeding fear and uncertainty. The civil war exploded violently. Castillos were besieged, battles were fought in the fields of Castile, and the blood ran through the rivers. You will wonder who joined each side. The answer is complex. Loyalties changed, alliances broke and formed again, driven by personal interest and fear. The nobility was divided, and war became a ruthless struggle for power and survival. Pedro, accustomed to opulence and luxury, found himself fighting for his own life and his crown. His cruelty, which was already legendary, intensified during the war. He did not hesitate to order executions, torture, and property confiscations to his enemies. Meanwhile, Enrique, with the support of France and Aragon, was gaining ground and consolidating his position. The war was not only a struggle for the throne, but a struggle for Castilla's own identity. The civil war broke out with all his fury. You saw how Pedro, despite his cruelty, was a cunning king on the battlefield. His initial victories were impressive, but Enrique's rebellion, supported by France and Aragon, spread like an oil stain. Castles constantly changed hands, the countryside became a scenario of looting and massacres, and the economy of the kingdom, already weakened, collapsed even more. His reign was an incessant succession of battles, betrayals, and executions. Pedro, known for his relentless thirst for revenge, did not hesitate to eliminate his opponents, even if they were members of his own family. The atrocities committed by their troops, and by himself, left a deep scar in the collective memory of Castile. The confidence in the monarchy broke irrecoverably. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. Despite his military ability, Peter's cruelty made him a deeply unpopular ruler. His actions caused constant resistance and cost him the support of many nobles, who saw Enrique de Constamara an alternative, even if it is an equally violent alternative. The kingdom, plunged into a ruthless civil war, bleeding slowly. His legacy would be that of a warrior king, but also that of a tyrant who took Castilla to the edge of the collapse. But you ask yourself, who really Pedro I? A bloodthirsty monster, as painted by the chronicles of their enemies, or a capable, although ruthless leader, who struggled to maintain the unity of Castile? The story, often, is written from the perspective of the winner, and in the case of Pedro, his adversaries had much to say about his legacy. His actions, unquestionably brutal, were magnified over time, feeding a black legend that eclipses other aspects of his reign. Remember its military victories, its ability to consolidate power, although through questionable methods. Imagine the perspective of a noble Castilian who, despite the violence, saw in Pedro a king capable of defending the kingdom of his enemies, a leader who, although he acted hard, kept the rebel nobles at bay and protected the borders. Was he a tyrant or an effective, but relentless ruling? The image we have of Pedro el Cruel is a complex mixture of reality and legend. The story presents us with facts, but the legend adds layers of interpretation, exaggeration, propaganda. You, as a spectator, should consider both perspectives to form your own opinion. What weight do you give the accusations of cruelty and the stories of their excesses? And what importance do you give to your military and political achievements, to your role as the defender of the kingdom? But the story, as is usually the case, is full of nuances. The chronicles, often written by their enemies, present it as a ruthless tyrant, a monster who murdered his own wife, Blanca de Bourbon, the same day of his coronation. Was it really like that? Or has the black legend that persecutes it exaggerated over the centuries, turning a complex king into an almost demonic figure? The death of Blanca de Bourbon, for example, is wrapped in mystery. Some speak of a premeditated murder, others of an accident or even a palatial conspiracy. The lack of overwhelming evidence allows the legend to expand, feeding the image of a king capable of any atrocity. You can decide which version convinces you. Other legends paint him as a powerful king, capable of controlling his noble rebels and maintaining the unity of his kingdom, that an ambitious leader, perhaps cruel, but effective in his government. However, the image of the murderous king, of the man who did not hesitate to eliminate his enemies, real or imaginary, has been recorded by fire in collective memory. But what is Pedro I? Is it only the memory of a murderous king, a dark spot in the history of Castile? For many historians, his reign, although marked by violence, also meant a period of a certain territorial expansion and consolidation of real power. Think of the administrative reforms that it implemented, even if they were often at the expense of the suffering of their people. His legacy, although complex, is undeniable. Its impact on the Castilian economy is also a key point to understand its legacy. Despite wars and instability, it promoted trade and crafts, although wealth concentrated on the hands of a few. Remember that the image we have of him is strongly influenced by the chronicles of his enemies, who surely exaggerated his defects to discredit him. In short, Pedro el Cruel is not just a story villain. His reign was a complex and contradictory period, with lights and shadows. Your opinion about its legacy will depend on what aspects highlights. Ruthless cruelty or reforms that, in their own way, modernized Castile. That he himself became a legend, an example of the complexities of power and ambition. But how can we separate the legend of reality in the history of Pedro I? The chronicles of the time, often written by monks or nobles with particular interests, are our main source. Imagine. Each story, dyed by loyalty or resentment towards the king, offers us a piece of puzzle, but no complete piece of the image alone. You must keep in mind that historical objectivity, as we understand it today, was an unknown concept in the 14th century. Analyze the sources carefully. Who wrote the chronicle? What motivations did it have? Was it a supporter of Pedro or his enemies, such as Enrique de Trastamara? Understanding the political and social context of the moment is key to interpreting information. Remember that propaganda and information manipulation were common tools in medieval times. Prosody is /speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The versions of Blanca de Bourbon's death, for example, vary considerably. Some chronicles paint her as an innocent victim of Pedro's cruelty, while others insinuate her participation in conspiracies against him. You have to assess the available evidence, comparing different stories and looking for possible biases or contradictions. Do not trust a single source. Search corroboration in others. But how did Pedro I compare with other kings of his time? Think of the powerful monarchs of France or England. They also dealt with ambitious nobles and constant wars, but often had more consolidated power structures. The fragmentation of the Castilian kingdom, with its powerful feudal lords, greatly hindered the government of Pedro, creating a much more unstable scenario than that of its contemporaries in other European countries. While kings like Eduardo III of England consolidated their power through successful military campaigns and a centralized administration, Pedro constantly looked against internal rebellion. Their cruel methods, although effective in some cases, generated more enemies than allies, weakening their position compared to monarchs that, despite their own cruelty, managed to maintain more firm control over their kingdoms. The key difference resided in the ability of these kings to build strategic alliances and maintain an image of stable authority, something that Pedro was elusive. His reputation of cruelty and his constant confrontations with the Castilian nobility isolated internationally, limiting his ability to obtain external support and leaving his kingdom vulnerable to intrigues and civil wars. Unlike his European peers, Pedro lacked the political stability necessary to consolidate his long-term power. But his story does not end there. You have seen how the figure of Pedro the Cruel has transcended time, reaching our time through popular culture. Imagine the scenes of films and books, where your reign, so full of drama and violence, becomes an inexhaustible source of inspiration for artists and writers. Think of the historical novels that have rebuilt their life, painting a complex portrait, sometimes contradictory, of a ruthless king but also capable of acts of great generosity. Have you wondered how they have portrayed it? As an implacable villain or as a product of his time, victim of the intrigues of the court? In the cinema, his figure has been interpreted in various ways, sometimes like a bloodthirsty tyrant, others as a complex and tormented leader. Have you seen a movie or series where your reign is represented? It is fascinating how the same story can be told in so many different ways, depending on the artist's perspective. But what happened with Blanca de Bourbon after his tragic murder? His death, a brutal blow to Castile, would not silence his legacy. Although his reign was fleeting, his image was recorded in the collective memory. A young queen, beautifully and cruelly snatched. Think of the outrage that he had to generate among his relatives, the sadness of a people who saw it as a symbol of hope. His death became a symbol of the brutality of Pedro I, feeding the black legend that would persecute him throughout history. In each story, in each ballad, its name resonated as an echo of injustice. Imagine it, turned into a compassion figure, of innocence betrayed in the middle of a scenario of power and cruelty. Although official history could try to silence it, popular memory kept it alive. Its short life, truncated so violently, fed the legends and songs that were transmitted from generation to generation, making it an iconic character of the time. Can you imagine the power of those stories, the way they kept their memory alive over time? But who ordered his murder? That is the question that lasts over time. Pedro the Cruel, her own husband, was the main suspect, of course, but the direct evidence has always been elusive. Was it an act of ruthless cruelty, a strategic elimination of a queen who was perhaps opposed, or something more murky, a conspiracy in the shadows of the Castilian court? Some historians point to the possibility that the order came from powerful enemies of Blanca, perhaps noble who saw in it a threat to their interests or an obstacle to their ambitions. The network of Palaciga's intrigues was complex and dangerous at that time, and Blanca's death could have been the result of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. And then there is the mystery of the homicidal weapon. What kind of weapon was used? Was it a white weapon, a poison, or something more insidious? The lack of conclusive evidence has fed speculation for centuries, giving free rein to the imagination and leaving the door open to numerous theories, some more fantasy than others. The truth, if it is ever known, remains hidden after the veil of time. Prosody. Speak. Speak to prosody rate equals 90%, but doubt persists. Was justice or revenge? Some historians point to a palatial conspiracy, others to the simple cruelty of Peter. You can judge yourself, seeing the available evidence. The death of Blanca de Bourbon, such a brutal act, projects a dark shadow on his reign, staining his blood legacy and betrayal. Was it an act of spite, an elimination of a political obstacle, or a mixture of both? His reign, marked by civil wars, betrayals, and unheard of violence, leaves us with a bitter taste. Pedro, a king who rose to the throne with a promise of justice, ended up being remembered for his cruelty. How could a man with so much power fall so low? The answer, perhaps, is found in the complexity of human nature and in the pressures of power. Reflect on it. The story of Pedro el Cruel is not only a narrative of facts, but a deep reflection on power, ambition, and the consequences of actions. A king who became synonymous with tyranny, leaving a length dyed with blood and a mystery that lasts to this day. What do you think about justice and revenge on your reign? Let's look at the facts. Blanca de Bourbon, your wife, lies dead on the floor of the Alcazar of Seville on the same day of your coronation. A blow, some say, in the head. An accident, perhaps, in the midst of the tumult of the celebration. But, really an accident? The wounds, according to witnesses, were deep and precise. Coincidence that happened just the day Pedro became a king, with his enemies stalking in the shadow? Some speak of a blunt weapon, others of a sharp object. The confusion reigned, the rumors, like poisonous snakes, slid down the halls of the palace. Was it a careless servant? A masked enemy taking advantage of the occasion? Or, maybe someone closer to her, someone with access to the palace and hidden motifs? The investigation, if there was superficial. Pedro, the new king, had a lot to win with the death of his wife. His reign was unstable, full of enemies and conspiracies. Eliminating Blanca also eliminated potential threats to his power. But, was it enough to justify the murder? That is the question that still chases you. Blanca's death, so suspicious, sowed discord in the kingdom. Your reign, Pedro, became a constant fight against your brothers, who saw in your instability the opportunity to claim the throne. The shadow of violence and doubt pursued you for years, feeding the civil wars that bleed Castile. Imagine the weight of that blood in your conscience, the burden of a fractured kingdom by your own actions. The consequences of your decision extended beyond your life. The political instability that you created weakened Castilla, making it vulnerable to its enemies. Think of the years of war, in the suffering of your people, in the legacy of violence you left behind you. Was it the price of the crown so high? Your story, Pedro, became a warning. A lesson about absolute power and its dangers. The history of Spain remembers your name as the Cruel, a ruthless monarch whose reign left a deep scar in the nation, a reminder of how single man's actions can change the course of an empire. But what happens if I tell you that the story of Pedro I, the Cruel One, is much more complex than it seems? Modern historians have begun to question the image of the ruthless monarch that has been transmitted for centuries. His reign is reviewed, not only from the prism of the chronicles written by their enemies, but analyzing the primary sources with greater care and context. It seeks to understand their actions, the motivations behind their decisions, and the socio-political context in which it developed. Some studies suggest that the image of Cruel has been exaggerated, the result of the propaganda of their enemies, which sought to delegitimize their reign. It is argued that many of the actions attributed to him, such as the execution of nobles, were common at the time. Violence was a political tool, and Pedro was not the only one who used it. The modern perspective seeks to clarify moral judgments, taking into account the norms and conventions of the medieval era. The impact of his reign on the development of Castile is also investigated. Although his government was marked by violence, administrative and economic reforms are also attributed that contributed to the consolidation of the kingdom. The modern perspective tries to understand its legacy in all its complexity, without simplifying it to a simple tyrannical stereotype. It is a difficult task, but necessary to understand the history of Castile more just and completely. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. So how do we judge Pedro I today? It's complicated, right? The traditional vision paints it as a bloodthirsty tyrant, responsible for the death of his wife Blanca de Bourbon, among other atrocities. But the new investigations provide nuances. Some historians argue that the image of Pedro el Cruel is a subsequent construction, a black legend fed by his political enemies. Think of the context. The 14 Castile was a hotbed of intrigues, civil wars and power struggles. Pedro I, in the midst of all that chaos, had to make hard decisions, sometimes cruel, to maintain his throne. Was it ruthless? Undoubtedly, he committed terrible acts, but was it worse than other kings of his time? That is the question we must ask ourselves. Pedro I's historical judgment is Therefore, a continuous process. We cannot judge it with the moral values of our time. We must understand its context, their motivations, and the pressures he faced. Does this mean that we justify your actions? No. It means that we must analyze them with the greatest possible objectivity, recognizing the complexity of the time and avoiding falling into simplistic judgments. But think about this. The story of Pedro the Cruel is not just a succession of crimes. It is a lesson on power, excessive ambition, and the consequences of governing with cruelty. His reign, although marked by violence, shows us how single-man decisions can deeply affect an entire kingdom, molding his future irreversibly. Note how the lack of legitimacy and political instability generated a cycle of violence that lasted decades. You can learn from your mistakes. The abuse of power, the lack of justice, and inability of Peter to connect with his people contributed to his fall. His reign reminds us of the importance of justice, responsibility, and compassionate leadership. A ruler who does not listen to his people is destined for failure, and his legacy will be stained by blood and suffering. When studying the life of Pedro el Cruel, we not only learn about a dark period in the history of Castile, but also reflect on the nature of power and its limits. Su historia nos serve de advertencia. Un recordatorio de que la crueldad y la tirania, aunque pueden parecer exitosas a corto plazo, siempre traen consecuencias devastadoras a largo plazo. It is a story that forces us to question our own values and to reflect on the type of leaders we want. Many ask me about Blanca de Bourbon, his second wife. Was it really as innocent as some paint? The truth is that its role in court is complex, surrounded by intrigues and suspicions. His marriage to Pedro was strategic, a political alliance that, however, did not fight it from the shadows of the Castilian court, where loyalty was a flexible concept. Another recurring doubt: how could Peter maintain power so long despite his cruelty? Part of the answer resides in his ability to manipulate the nobility, rewarding his allies and eliminating his enemies with brutal efficiency. Fear, more than love, consolidated his reign, creating a climate of terror that kept his opponents at bay. And finally, the question that many ask yourself: was his death a murder or a consequence of his actions? The truth is that the death of Pedro the Cruel was a culminating point of a life full of violence and betrayal. Enrique de Constamra, his stepbrother, defeated him in battle, but Pedro's cruelty had sown the seeds of his own destruction. And so, we reach the end of the story of Pedro el Cruel. A story full of betrayals, love, and, of course, death. I hope you enjoyed this trip to the 14th century Spanish. It has been a pleasure to tell you and discover with you the shadows and lights of this controversial king. But this is not the only fascinating story that the past reserves. In the next videos, we will explore other equally captivating episodes. Get ready to immerse yourself in new intrigues, meet unforgettable characters, and discover hidden secrets of history. I am already working on new scripts, investigating characters and events that will leave you breathless. Subscribe to not miss any historical adventure. Remember to activate the bell to receive notifications every time you upload a new video. And now, a special thanks to all of you, my dear subscribers, for your constant support. Your comments, likes, and shared are what make this channel possible. Without you, this adventure through the history of Pedro the Cruel would not have been the same. Thank you for accompanying me on this trip to the past, for your interest and for your questions that encourage me to continue investigating. /prosody, /speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. I also want to thank the researchers, historians, and authors whose jobs I have consulted to create this video. His meticulous research has been the fundamental basis of my narrative. His publications have allowed me to enter the complexity of the time and better understand the life and reign of Pedro I of Castile. Without his work, this video would not be possible. Last but not least, special thanks to my edition team for your dedication and professionalism. His work has been essential to give life to this story, transforming research into an attractive and easy-to-understanding visual product. His patience and critical eye have been fundamental for the final result. Thanks for your effort. But the story of Pedro the Cruel is not limited to the written chronicles. Thanks to historical research, we have access to images and documents of the time that allow us to visualize, even partially, the world in which he lived. Imagine, for a moment, the letters sealed with the real seal, the elegant and precise calligraphy, the thorough details in the writing that tell us about the intrigues and alliances of the Castilian court. Think of illuminated manuscripts, with their vibrant colors and their detailed images that represent scenes of courtly life, battles, or even portraits of Blanca's Blanca, the unfortunate queen. Although there is no unequivocal portrait of it, the iconography of the time gives us an idea of how it could have been. Even the ruins of the castles and palaces of the time, which still last, tell us about the greatness and opulence of the Castilian court of the 14th century. Look at the architectural details, the stones eroded by the passage of time, the brands that Pedro the Cruel himself could have left in his constructions. They are silent vestiges of a turbulent era. But expect, how can we really understand the scope of the kingdom of Pedro el Cruel and his constant wars? This is where our interactive map enters. Castilla visualizes in the 14th century, observe the borders, the key cities, the strategic castles. Everything comes alive. Look how he expanded and contracted his power throughout his reign, depending on alliances and battles. Imagine following the steps of Pedro I, from Seville, its capital, to the border areas in dispute with Portugal and Aragon. Click on each city, each castle, and discover its historical importance in the context of its reign. You will see how geography influenced its military and political decisions. It is an incredible tool to understand the complexity of the time. It will allow you to better understand Pedro's military strategies, his alliances and rivalries, and the impact that his reign had on the political configuration of the Iberian Peninsula. It is not just a map, it is a window to the past, a tool that will allow you to explore medieval Castilla with an unmatched depth. Explore every corner, every detail, and build your own understanding of this convulsed period. I hope you have been interesting. If you liked, like and subscribe for more stories. What do you think about the reign of the cruel? Leave me your comment. /prosody/speak